This is the first of the utility briefings for SAWS. We've been asked to essentially follow CPS and talk to you all about different topics. And the topic that was chosen today, the mayor and his staff thought that talking about the Vista Ridge project would be a good idea. Obviously, it's a very important project, but it's also a project that a lot of you on council were not a part of when it was originally voted on. So it essentially is a very big water project. It's one of the biggest in the United States as far as a P3 project. It is designed to bring water from 140 miles northeast of Austin, 140 miles away, which is a little bit northeast of Austin, and 50,000 acre feet to provide water security for our future. What you see here is a cartoon that appeared in the 1980s in the San Antonio Light newspaper, essentially letting the communities know that water supply was hindering growth. And this is a cartoon that could appear in any major newspaper in any major city, and it's one that periodically will appear if a city cannot get its water future in check and really address the issue. So that was what San Antonio was trying to do for throughout the years. But first we had to overcome some obstacles, and particularly it was a federal endangered species lawsuit that was filed to protect some endangered species in the Springs area. And as a result of that, Judge Lucius Button ordered pumping limits for San Antonio and for this entire region. In other words, the amount of water that we were getting out of the Edwards aquifer was going to be curtailed. And in response to that, the state legislature passed legislation that did, in fact, put those limits into law. And not only that, the legislation also said that in the next 15 years, those pumping limits were going to be further reduced. So San Antonio had to get its act together, had to really do something within those 15 years. The response to those legislative limits was to, first of all, start conserving water. And we became the best in the nation for that. We have very good water conservation programs, and they've been on into the future and on into the present. During that time, we also built the largest recycled water system in the nation, and we also developed an ASR project, which has now become the largest groundwater system in the nation. But despite these successes, we still needed additional water supply. And you see here, which is essentially a cadaver of the projects that we have attempted to do in our water history. The Applewhite reservoirs of the 1980s and the 1990s, Cimbro Aquifer, you see all of the planned yield, a lot of water, the year they were supposed to be online, and the dollars expended. But the big takeaway from this slide is the zeros there. Zero water. We did not get any water from these projects. They essentially fell victim to regulatory, political issues. It's not engineering, and it wasn't really that we couldn't afford it as a community. It's just that we couldn't get them off the ground. These never came out of the design phase, but a lot of serious money was spent. Two in particular, lawsuits were filed because of those. We got some of the money back on some of these projects, but still it was something that was not successful. And as I mentioned, the reasons were political, legal, and regulatory. Here in Texas, when you talk about groundwater, it's a very archaic system of either permitting water, getting water out of the ground, and transporting that water. These groundwater districts are usually elected or appointed by elected officials, and it seems like their overriding mission is to prevent the development of that water, to prevent the production of that water out of the ground, and also to prevent that movement of water outside of the county. So you can imagine having to go in front of your ratepayers, in front of your constituents, spending millions and millions of dollars and not being able to tell them that you're going to get water at the end of this. And you have to spend water on the design phase, on the development phase, with no guarantees that you're going to have any kind of fruitful projects. So that is what we were facing. So even with we had some successes, but even these successes were marginalized. You see two projects in particular planned in the early 2000s. They did come, they were completed, 2013, 2017, but you see the planned yield, one project, the top project, 1/5 of the planned yield came to fruition. The Brackish plant originally was designed to almost 30,000 acre feet, and even that had to be cut back to about 13,000 acre feet. And essentially the reasons, again, are political And they're not necessarily the design, the engineering design, or anything like that. It's just you can't get them off the ground without the risk associated with that. But even with those successes, we still had the need for additional water, which brings us to Vista Ridge. And because of those risks, what I wanted to do when I got to SAWS was to do something differently. So we put out a request for competitive seal proposals, asking the private sector to bring 50,000 acre-feet of water into San Antonio and to take on the risks of doing that. And that's essentially what this project was in a nutshell. And those risks are pretty serious. They're pretty ominous. Project development, how are you going to get the financing? How are you going to pay for that, that money that you borrow, the interest rates involved? Once you get that, if you do get the financing and you start constructing, all kinds of permits, endangered species. What if you happen across endangered species as you're building the pipeline? The rights of way, all of the politics involved in getting the easements and obtaining those easements are all risks that we have to take on these projects. The availability of labor, of supplies, of equipment are all risks that we wanted to shift over to the private sector. And once your project is built, once it's ongoing, you still have a tremendous amount of risk. And the particular risk that's always very dangerous and when you deal with groundwater is permitting risk. So you have a permit, say, of getting 25,000 acre-feet of water out of the ground. At any time, that elected body or that appointed body can meet and cut your project in half. Say that instead of 25,000 acre-feet, now you can only pump half of that. And that is exactly what happened to us in the Schertz-Seguin project. So what we needed to do was shift some of those risks away. We received 9 proposals. We narrowed it down to 3. Even those 3 that we narrowed down did not accept all of the risks that we were talking about. But we had enough of an idea that our board told us to at least start negotiations with one particular consortium. And the reason they were singled out of the other 3, although they didn't necessarily take all the risk at the beginning, was because they had water permits already. None of the other proposals had water. In their proposal, they would get the water, they would obtain the water. But this particular consortium already had the water permits. And essentially, it was a consortium made up of Abengoa, which is a multinational company out of Spain, Blue Water, a Texas-based company that had the water leases. They had ownership of the water, and Garney, a Kansas City construction-based company. So we started negotiating with them, knowing that the fundamental tenets of this project were going to be 4. One of them is to shift all of those risks away from us and onto the private sector. We did not want another one was we did not want the project to originate from the Edwards Aquifer. We wanted to diversify ourselves off of the Edwards, and so the project could not originate from there. We also did not want to substitute this project for water conservation. Water conservation was always going to be something that was very important. And lastly was respect of the local groundwater management. Although I mentioned that groundwater districts are hard to deal with, we still have to deal with them. It's still their water, it's still their policies, it's still their hometowns that you have to deal with, so we have to respect whatever rules and regulations came out of there. So we began an unprecedented process of negotiating this contract in public. We wanted to make sure that there was no feeling of distrust or of not inclusion. We held meetings. Individuals that came to participate were able to see the give and flow of the conversations that we had. Council members showed up. Council members sent their staff. The environmental community showed up. The development community showed up. Reporters showed up. So everybody had a chance to see what was going on. The contract that we came up with was brought before our board and brought before council in November of 2014. They both approved it. It was a 50,000 acre-feet project where SAWS only pays for the water delivered, and that's going to be a very important point, that we only pay for water delivered. It's a 30-year contract with another 30 years after that, and the reason it's bifurcated in 2 is the initial 30 years is with the Abengoa group, and they essentially are building the project. At the end of that 30 years, all of the rights of way, all of the pumps, the pipes, the facilities, the wells, they all transfer to SAWS. And then the other 30 years is an agreement that we already have in place with the leaseholders of the water to to have essentially a 60-year project. It also provides for a fixed price. In other words, the price that we pay today is the same price that we pay 30 years from now. And the key to this is at the end of the 30 years, the price drops. And the price drops because we essentially will have paid for the pipeline, all of the infrastructure already, all of the debt will have been paid. And when you have a 30-year agreement, you know that things can happen in those 30 years. So we wanted a provision in the contract that for whatever reason, there was going to be a different partner that we were going to be with for those 30 years, that we had control over that. And sure enough, the global economy hit Abengoa. They fell on very serious, hard financial situations, and they started selling a lot of their American assets. And in particular, ours was one of them that they knew was a very valuable asset, so in effect they wanted to sell that because it was so valuable. But we had control over that. They couldn't just sell it to whoever they wanted to, and in fact, their first or two choices are ones that we rejected. And they finally reached an agreement with Garney Construction. They were part of the original consortium, and Garney Construction, the construction company, bought 80% of the project. Abengoa remained with 20%. Garney brings with them a long history with SAWS and with the city. Over 50 years of contracts with them, going back and forth, where they build a lot of our infrastructure. Part of that agreement that we had with them was in higher standards of the materials and of the equipment in the construction of the project. Also, being a construction company, Garney knows that they don't want to operate this system for the next 30 years. So within the contract also, there's an opportunity of changing out the operator of the project. That'll probably happen in 2018. Requests for qualifications have already been issued. Again, that is subject to our consent. So the project itself is about 19 wells, 142 miles, 3 pump stations to move that water, a terminal storage tank. Overall, they're going to spend about $927 million to put this infrastructure in the ground. A project timeline, you'll see a development phase, which we've already gone through for about 30 months. We are currently in the construction phase. We've already had financial close, and that's a very key date to where we knew this project was really going to get off the ground, where the project company, Garney, was able to obtain the necessary financing to get this project off the ground. Prior to that, we locked in the interest rate so that we know at that point we knew what we were going to pay for this water for the next 30 years. The water will start being delivered in 2020, probably April of 2020. 30 years from then is when the transfer takes place of all the assets back over to SAWS, and then another 30 years after the drop in price of our continued relationship with the leaseholders. I talked about the ability to lock in the interest rate. What that did for us was when we first negotiated the contract, we put a maximum in there that you could not charge us more than a certain price for the water, and that price was $1,959 per acre foot. With the ability to lock in the price during that time period, we locked in at a point where we were able to fix the cost at $1,606 per acre foot, and that's the cost for the next 30 years. This ability to lock in the rate saved our ratepayers $529 million. So originally this project was a $1.3 billion project, but with this savings it brought cost avoidance brought to our customers. We are responsible for the O&M cost, the maintenance and the electrical part of this, and those are subject to escalation and inflation. I want to get a little bit more specific about that interest rate lock because it is something that our ratepayers should be very proud about, the ability to have the cost avoidance on that. You'll see the key date there of May 17th, 2016. That's when we were able to lock in the interest rates. And you'll see the interest rates essentially going up and down, but a general downward trend during that time period in 2016 to where we, under the contract, knew that we could lock in at a certain point. And so once we hit that time period within the contract, we locked in, and the all-time low was just a few months later than that, but the key to that is that they start going up. And we worked with Garney to make sure that financial close happened at a certain point before the election of 2016, because we knew, our financial advisors let us know, that interest rates oftentimes go up during an election And in fact, they did. So the fact that we were able to do financial close in November of 2016 essentially saved the project, because if we had not closed at that point, the economics of the project would not have been as favorable to Garney to continue on with the project. So now we have a project that's off the development phase, off the financing phase, and is in active construction. It's construction in all 7 counties that it goes through. Essentially, they've started at each end, north going south, south going north, and 2 points in the middle, both going north and south. The well field is under active development, and the facilities, the pump stations, are also under construction. We have certain responsibilities under this contract, and the main one is to the purchase of water. Obviously, this whole concept is whether or not a utility like San Antonio can pay for this project. And thanks to our city council and our board, we have the rates to support this project. So any water from 50,000 feet on down, we have to pay for. This is regardless of our particular demand, of our particular wet year or dry year. That 50,000 acre feet, if it's delivered to San Antonio of a certain quality, we have to purchase. We also have the right to establish electric power. We wanted to have that responsibility because we feel we can better negotiations with the public utilities from here to Burleson County. We also have the right to monitor the execution of the construction. Some of those individuals that work for SAWS are here that you may not see on a usual basis, that have responsibility over this project. This is going to be our project in 30 years, so we want to make sure that it's being built adequately, correctly, and with the right materials. A particular responsibility of ours is the integration of that water into San Antonio. Currently, our system would not be able to accept 50,000 acre feet on any given day at one time, any given year. So we have to look at our infrastructure and make some improvements. Treatment facilities, calcium may or may not have to be added to the water to make it compatible with Edwards. We have to build a new pump station, ground storage tanks, change out valves, pumps, SCADA control. These are all improvements that we are doing ahead of time. Some of these were things that we were going to do anyway, but this project moved up their timeline. The red line that you see going south to north is was essentially a bare met pipeline that we inherited, but we obviously inspected it, make sure it could accept this type of water. And it's essentially a 15-mile pipeline. Most of it's already built. There is a small section at the very north part that is a new pipeline. Also a negotiating point in the contract was the ability to have the exclusive right to sell water from that pipeline. This pipeline is going through a very high growth area of Texas, of the United States, and there's opportunities there to sell water to our communities. This would make a very good partnership with other communities, make sure that we are good neighbors with them. The key to this, however, is can you do it? Do you have the capacity to do it? And this slide shows that if the policy that we get back from our city council and from our board says that it is something that we can do, we show that if you replicate the drought of record starting in 2021, you'll see that you have your first issues in 2027, but you still have surplus water there of about 31,000 acre feet. So with the addition of Vista Ridge, you do have the opportunity, if our board and the council desires, to have SAWS be more of a wholesale provider of water in this region. So the threshold question is to sell or not to sell. The ability is there, but that's the threshold question. So if you do, for how long? Whether it's the entire 30 years of our contract or for shorter periods of time. And how much water do you sell? Is it a small increments of 1,000 acre feet or a very large amount of up to 15,000 acre feet? And if you do sell this water to them, do they take on some of the risks that we took on, such as potential cutbacks from the project company? So if for whatever reason the groundwater district says it's only a 45,000 acre feet project, therefore there's a like percentage reduction you're wholesaling the water to. And what is the price of that water? Should it be the same as the Vista Ridge price? Should it be a different price? And if you're, and it's not just necessarily selling Vista Ridge water, but if you have excess water in our whole inventory, we could be selling different water, for example, from Canyon Lake, from our other sources at a Vista Ridge water price. These are all issues that we want to educate our board on, educate council on, and have some idea about those. This also gives San Antonio and SAWS the opportunity to have a role in the growth of this area. We could have restrictions depending, again, on the policy that is set, that we discourage the sale of this water in sensitive areas, sensitive environmental areas. These are things that will be talked about with council and our board in the future. In summation, Mayor and Council, what we have is a project that really secures our water future for our lifetime, and our kids will be thanking us for what we've done for them. It's tomorrow's water at today's price. It's a long-term, sustainable water source to sustain our economy. It's the transfer of the regulatory issues that I mentioned, the risk issues that I mentioned, the construction issues that I mentioned. It provides environmental benefits because of the relief that the Edwards will get from this, and it's a potential for regional partnerships. Thank you, Mayor, and I'll encourage any questions that you may have.